Hello, I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga, and this week for our Saturday matinee, we'll take a brief look at Mississauga's historic connections to the Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917. Our look at the historic soldiers who served and fell from what is now Mississauga has focused across many conflicts, including, of course, the First World War, and documenting 96 young sons of historic Mississauga who did not return home. The First World War has many milestone moments or battles within, and Vimy Ridge is but one of them. But soldiers from Mississauga served, and many fell there at Vimy Ridge over 100 years ago in April of 1917. We can look throughout our community at the different ways in which our soldiers, our fallen soldiers, are commemorated, whether they're at many of the war memorials and cenotaphs dotted throughout Mississauga, or honor rolls, uh, dedicated windows, family cemeteries, rules of honor. There's numerous places in which the fallen veterans from our community are remembered. Um, Telling their it's really about telling their story in terms of what we do. Who were they, where did they live, what was their service, when did they die, where are they buried, where are they remembered. I mean, this really is the focal point of remembrance, and that uh, young individuals from this community many years ago stood up to serve their country, and in the First World War, the British Empire as well, and many fell in that service. And so we want to make sure that we do not forget their story and forget the sacrifice made by those so long ago. Where do you start when you're looking at the First World War? Not just the Battle of Vimy Ridge, but the First World War as a whole. I mean, we have existing lists on cenotaphs, but many other places: newspaper records, cemetery records, archival material, family history material that's been collected over time. The scant photographs, but we do have photographs as well. There's just countless ways to look at resources, look for resources. Uh, Military records, attestation papers. Library and Archives Canada has tremendous records for soldiers from the First World War, and service files and the like. And of course, there are regiments and today that perpetuate those that served in the First World War and remember those that fell within that conflict. So, it's a very worthwhile process, or a project to investigate those that volunteered to serve, and many again who did not return home. When we look at kind of Canadian involvement, as we come down specific to one battle in particular, but Canadian involvement in the First World War was all about sending men to the front, sending soldiers. We were a dominion of the British Empire. The job of the Dominion was to provide manpower to support the British war effort. Canada, as the other dominions, did not control their own military nor overseas policy. So when Great Britain declared war in August of 1914, Canada was automatically at war, and the propaganda posters begin to kind of tell the story of what's expected of from here at home, looking for volunteers to serve. And it all came down to numbers. 619,000 enlisted men from Canada with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Conscription began in January of 1918, but it really didn't have a big impact in terms of overall numbers about the Canadians that went overseas. Of the 619,000 who enlisted, 60,661 Canadian casualties. That is roughly 1 in 10 soldiers do not come home. And then we have some general numbers with some uncertainty there for Peel and historic Mississauga, around 700 soldiers, we believe, from historic Mississauga who served. But of those, we've documented 96 fallen from this community. And so again, what is their story? How did they connect to the bigger picture of the First World War? And more importantly, where did they fall and where are they remembered? Looking at specifically the one battle within the First World War, and that is the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which raged between April 9th and April 12th of 1917, really was a significant chapter of Canadian involvement in the First World War. It was the first time that Canadians fighting as Canadians under Canadian command all four divisions of Canadian troops fought together, and they were given the what was really seen as an unachievable task. Both British and French forces had tried to dislodge the Germans from the high ground of Vimy Ridge several times prior to 1917, both to horrendous losses. And the Germans had strongly fortified and dug in at the high ground around Vimy Ridge. So it was a strategic high ground overlooking a rather relatively lower flat plain. The Canadians were given this task as much to attempt to dislodge the Germans as it was to occupy the forces that were there. The Battle of Vimy Ridge was part of a much larger offensive frontage during the spring of 1917, known as the Arras Offensive. And both a coordinated attack between Britain and its allies, as well as France, at different portions along this massive front on the German front. The only real objective that achieved its aims was at Vimy. So strategically, it was not an important victory, so to speak, in the course of the First World War, although it became one that was celebrated almost immediately in the lore of Canadian and Canadian nationalism. Of this thing that Canadians had achieved that others had seen as unachievable. They fought under a separate flag, the Vimy Red Ensign. Canada was again a dominion of the British Empire. We don't have our own flag at that point, or the maple leaf is not born at that point. Although the soldiers themselves wore maple leafs on their cap badges. The flag again was the red ensign. And when we look at the Vimy Memorial today, one of the more iconic remembrance symbols for Canada, the Vimy Memorial stands on Hill 145, which was one of the objectives at Vimy Ridge, the highest point of the ridge. And so it stands on, if you will, ground zero for the Canadian attack. So when you look at the Arras offensive, it was a massive German frontage with different strategic points that were part of the attack plan between British and French forces. The arrow there in the middle pointing to where Vimy Ridge is there. You can just see it on the left. So the Vimy Ridge was but one point within a larger offensive. But the Canadians were months of preparation leading up to it, entrenched themselves in, utilized underground salt mines, dug kilometers of trenches, and subways that allowed troops to come out closer to the German front lines than were anticipated. Railway lines, communication networks, thousands of soldiers were brought in largely at night to obscure their numbers from German eyes. The full mock-up of the train was created. Soldiers were trained again and again on the objectives of the attack. The command was decentralized for the Canadians. Right down to the platoon level. If a commander or an officer were to be killed, the platoon could continue on. As soldiers and non-commissioned officers were given compasses and maps and clear objectives of what each Canadian division was to achieve. And so it really was kind of a turning point in how the war was managed and prosecuted from the Canadian perspective. They also, to perfection, followed what became known as the Vimy Glide. When the attack began, they used bombardment that was just in front of the advancing troops to use kind of the shells, the exploding earth and whatnot, as screen, as cover to protect the advancing troops on the German positions. One of the sayings were, if you couldn't dislodge the Germans from their trenches, you kept them in their trenches with the bombardment, so that they couldn't come out to create an offensive and to protect against the Canadian advance. And so this creeping barrage, again known as the Vimy Glide, was executed to perfection. But leading up to that, the attack on Vimy Ridge, the methodical planning began or culminated in a week of shelling on the German positions. And 1.6 million shells were poured between March 20th and April 8th on German positions along the Vimy battlefield. And Germans referred to it as a week of suffering. And then the shells, the bombardment ceased in the evening of April 8th, and then at 5:30 in the morning on April 9th, the creeping barrage began as the Canadian troops poured out of the underground souterrain caverns and began their assault on Vimy Ridge. And it was something with precision, but also tremendous speed. And indeed, by about halfway through the day on April 9th, most of the German objectives had been taken by the Canadians. There were a couple of outliers with Hill 145 and then Hill 120, which was known as the Pimple, that remained in contest for several days. The Pimple finally falling to Canadian hands on April 12th. Tremendous casualties with the Canadian Corps at the time. Almost 3,600 dead and about 7,000 wounded as a result of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. So again, absolutely astronomical. Of those, 7 killed from historic Mississauga and 11 known wounded from historic Mississauga at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And they all have their stories in terms of the lives themselves. But again, the initial attack, 15,000 Canadians, 4 divisions under Canadian command, just under 3,600 killed, 7,004 wounded. And from Mississauga, again, we have 7 killed, 11 wounded, and 1 died much later of wounds sustained at Vimy. And so it just was, in that sense, an iconic time for Canadian soldiers. We look at those killed in action at Vimy. Private Dennis Anger of St. Peter's Anglican Church in Arundel. He fell on March 1st of 1917, over a month before the Battle of Vimy Ridge commenced, but he was killed in reconnaissance on German trench positions when an officer he was with the 75th Battalion was shot by a German sniper, and then Private Anger, attempting to aid his fallen officer, was killed by a sniper as well. Others, Sergeant Thomas Cartwright of Arundel, Eli Rossiter of Port Credit and Clarkson. He was one of the few that had children at the time. A young son remained at home. Lieutenant James Fawcett, born in Streetsville, living in Berks Falls, was a newspaper editor. And so we have Joseph Clark of Streetsville was a baker, and William Kidd and Jack Young of Clarkson worked as farmhands and gardeners on local farms. Sergeant Thomas Cartwright of Arundel was reportedly quite an athlete and a baseball player, and attended St. Peter's Anglican Church in Arundel. And so we have a lot of these stories of individuals who served and kind of the loss left behind by their families, and even those that served and were wounded, we have tremendous stories of as well. And so, Vimy Ridge rings through, the word Vimy rings through Canadian history as a somber moment of remembrance, but also of national pride, of something that Canadians achieved. Canadians from coast to coast to coast, all provinces, many towns and communities represented in those that served and those that fell at Vimy Ridge. So again, it is a milestone moment for Canadian achievement in the First World War. The Canadian Corps would go on to tremendous victories in other locations, Cambrai, one of them, that had bigger impact on the overall war itself. But Vimy was the first major achievement as Canadians, first time Canadians served together, the rise of Arthur Currie, the general. And so Vimy again rings through Canadian history. So thank you for joining us here at Heritage Mississauga.